This is the case of Andrea Gordon, the bank manager who was convicted of fraud in 2021 in the Supreme Court of Judicature of Jamaica in the criminal division between Regina, the Crown, and Andrea Gordon, the defendant. Mrs. Andrea Martin Swaby, Deputy Director of Public Prosecution for the Crown, and Mr. Vincent Wellesley for the defendant. Sentence plea guilty. She pled guilty. Larceny as a servant, 3 counts. Breaches of Section 4, subsection 1 of the Cybercrimes Act, and Section 3 counts. Breaches of the Proceeds of Crime Act, 7 counts. Heard the 29th of April and the 31st of May 2021. Background: the defendant was employed to the National Commercial Bank, which is referred to here as the bank, as a manager at the operations branch. She had been employed to the bank for 30 years. In her capacity as an employee and a manager of the bank, she was issued with a unique access code, which she used when undertaking transactions. Enquiries were made by Mr. Richard Hines, who is the manager of the fraud unit of the bank, as to the use of the defendant's code in relation to a number of transactions where funds were withdrawn from the bank's internal account. Pursuant to these enquiries, Mr. Richard Hines visited the office of the defendant to speak to her about transactions that were of concern to him. The defendant started to cry and indicated to him that she had indeed misappropriated sums from the bank's internal account. The matter was reported to the police and the defendant was arrested and charged. The defendant pleaded guilty to an indictment containing 13 counts. The defendant pleaded guilty to the following offenses: 3 counts of larceny as a servant, contrary to the Larceny Act. In count 1, she was indicted for stealing $24,522,217.47 from the bank. In count 2, she is indicted for stealing $202,152 from the bank. And in count 3, she is indicted for stealing $7,076,082.36 from the said bank. 3 counts of access with intent to commit an offense, to wit: larceny by a servant contrary to the Cybercrimes Act 2015. These counts are related to the method by which the defendant transferred funds from the bank's internal account, that is, through the bank's computer system. 7 counts of engaging in a transaction that involves criminal property contrary to the Proceeds of Crime Act, that is, in count 7, a transaction where the defendant purchased clothing and accessories through Purple Couriers Limited, valued at $83,000, knowing that this property was derived from the offense of larceny as a servant. So she purchased $83,000 worth of clothes with the stolen money. In count 8, a transaction where $70,000 was transferred to a third party for repairs to a home at Nightingale Drive, Bushy Park, knowing that this property was derived from the offense of larceny as a servant. In count 9, a transaction where the defendant deposited $81,500 into an account for the purchase of clothing, knowing that this property was derived from the offense of larceny as a servant. In count 10, a transaction where the defendant deposited $12,000 into an account at the bank for the purchase of Gibson Relay tickets, which was derived from the offense of larceny as a servant. In count 11, a transaction where the defendant transferred $24,000 into an account of two individuals, knowing that this property was derived from the offense as larceny as a servant. In count 12, a transaction where the defendant, that's Mrs. Gordon, Andrea Gordon, facilitated checks drawn on an account in the sum of $8,900,000, knowing that this was property derived from the offense of larceny as a servant. In count 13, on diverse days between January 1st, 2017 and the 30th of May 2020, the defendant facilitated the preparation of checks drawn, that Andrea Gordon, Mrs. Gordon, facilitated the preparation of checks drawn on an account to be paid to various business places, knowing that this property was derived from the offense of larceny as a servant. Whoa. So we had 2017, 18, 19, 20, that's 3 years so far. And then it was only an additional year in 2021 that they discovered the fraud. So we continue. On the 29th of April 2021, the defendant, Mrs. Gordon, pleaded guilty to the above mentioned offenses. A social inquiry report and an antecedent report were requested. Alright, I briefly paused the recording of this video to look up antecedent. I looked it up online. It says an antecedent, the meaning, it is a thing that existed before or logically precedes another. Okay, so it's something referring to the past. So here, social inquiry report and an antecedent report were requested. In approaching sentencing, I took into consideration the relevant statutes, the sentencing guidelines launched in January 2018, as well as case laws. statutes. I looked up statutes online. It says here from the Collins Dictionary online, a statute is a rule or a law which has been made by a government or other organization and formally written down. Okay, so it is the law. I took into consideration the relevant statutes. The sentencing guidelines launched in January 2018, as well as case law. The statutes. There are 3 statutes that are relevant in relation to offenses that the defendant pleaded guilty to. They are the Larceny Act, the Access to Information Act, and the Cybercrimes Act 2015. The Larceny Act. The defendant was indicted for 3 counts of larceny as a servant, which is contrary to Section 22 of the Larceny Act. Section 22 of the Larceny Act states that every person who, 1, being a clerk or servant or person employed in the capacity of a clerk or servant, 4, A, steals any chattel means things that belong to you. Okay, it's an old-fashioned word. Steals any chattels, or any chattel, CHATTEL, or money or valuable security belonging to or in possession or power of his master or employer, or shall be guilty of felony, and on conviction thereof liable to imprisonment with hard labor for any term not exceeding 10 years. Access with intent to commit an offense, the Cybercrimes Act. The defendant is charged with 3 counts of access with intent to commit an offense, which is contrary to Section 4, subsection 1 of the Cybercrime Act. On conviction for an offense under this act, the possible penalties for these offenses are detailed in Section 4, subsection 4 of the said act are: 1. A fine or imprisonment for a term not exceeding 5 years, or to both such fine or imprisonment. Or 2. If any damage is caused as a result of the commission of the offense, a fine or imprisonment for a term not exceeding 7 years, or to both such fine and imprisonment. Then there is the Proceeds of Crime Act. The defendant is also charged with 7 counts of engaging in a transaction that involves criminal property, which is contrary to Section 9, subsection 1 of the Proceeds of Crime Act. On conviction for this offense, the possible penalties are detailed in Section 98 of the said act are: 1. In the case of an individual, to a fine or imprisonment for a term not exceeding 20 years, or to both such fine and imprisonment. And 2. In the case of a body corporate, to a fine. So a body corporate would be a company, so they cannot lock up a company, so it would have to be a fine. Discount. I will continue reading from this count in another video.